Hey,
Hello.
Jessica, how are
Hello.
you?
I'm very well. How are you, Greg?
I am extremely well. I'm just going to turn the sound up. There we go.
Brilliant.
Yes,
Very interesting
good.
background you have there. You've got lots of interesting features around you.
We lived in Mexico for a couple of years, so
Mhm.
there's a lots of little knickknacks around the place because
Mm,
they do. I mean, artisanal crafts are really strong in Mexico, so there's a lot of it.
yes.
A lot
And
of it.
every artifact tells its own story, doesn't it?
Doesn't it just? Doesn't it just? And you know that's why I was fascinated by the topic for this year's conference because I thought, stories are. I think storytelling is a lost art,
Mhm.
and and it's so valuable to us. It's absolutely so valuable,
It is.
and and when we rediscover, that art, we are all storytellers. We are all capable of telling stories. We all have stories to tell,
The thing
and
is, you see, Greg, the thing is this, that you see, you and I, sometimes it's like preaching to the converted. You and I both
yes,
agree that stories are really powerful. We both agree
yeah,
that, and it's all. And I look at your pieces on the wall there, and I think, well, I'm sure there's a brilliant, powerful story there, and you
yeah,
agree with me. The thing is, you
yeah.
see, a scientist who is researching in natural sciences, and they think, no, it's an object. It's made of this, and it's like, using these colors and whatever, it's like they can't really relate to the fact that there
Uh,
is
uh, uh, yeah,
something
it's
more
interesting. I
tangible.
think they can, but they don't allow themselves to,
Mhm.
because because they have lost themselves in the definition of their jobs, of their functions, of their careers, and so they think, well, we're scientists, so we deal in formulae, and and our peers want proof. They want proof of efficacy. They want proof of theory. They want. I mean, so there aren't many stories there,
They
but the
can
best
also have, they
scientists were
can,
storytellers.
yeah, but thinking about the object, a scientist will want to know, well, if I want to replicate this, if I want to create something exactly like this, what's the kind of mold I need to use? What, like, how do I do it? What's the recipe?
Mm.
What's the methodology? And whereas the heart and soul of it, it's not tangible. The heart and soul of a story of, your experience in Mexico, the experience itself is a memory now, right?
Yes, yes, and also the the story of each piece, and it doesn't matter whether you're talking about Mexican crafts or whatever, um, is what brings it to life. Because otherwise, it is simply, it's a piece of wood cut to a certain shape, painted with a message on it.
Mhm.
I think, yeah, physically that's what it is, but there's more to it, and it's. I've had many conversations with people, and I'm working with some educators in Malaysia at the moment, um, and we're just trying to address the issue, and it's a global issue, that education systems are set up to measure um, the logical and the measurable. To measure what is measurable, and what is scoreable, if you like,
Mhm.
rather than creativity. And in this country, um, and I know in other countries as well, education systems try to evaluate students on measures of literacy and numeracy, and they evaluate school performances on literacy and numeracy. But it's all theory. It's all the theory of words and spelling, and it's not about how do you use those words? What do you do with them? What do you create with them?
Mhm.
And that's what's missing. I don't think, certainly as long as I live, that education systems worldwide will ever find a way to really foster and and evaluate creativity?
Well, the education systems are created according to our worldview. You live in Australia and you know that the Aborigines, the Aboriginal people, they are storytellers, and
Absolutely.
an education curriculum which has a worldview based on Western values may not be best for them to develop the skills that they need to develop because they're storytellers, right?
Yeah,
So,
it's look. I think it's. I mean, I think you mentioned Aborigines, and there are many cultures around the world that have relied on storytelling to pass down culture. You know, to keep their culture alive, to pass down history, and creation. Around the world has been told through storytelling. It doesn't matter what you believe. The stories told through Greek gods, Roman gods, scriptures, Aboriginal dream time, whatever. That's all about creativity and creation, and it's passed down through stories. And I think it's, for me, it was always, if you think about trivia champions, I mean, they're very, very good at remembering facts. And that's basically what they're being tested on, their ability to remember facts. But even if you watch The Chase, when those chasers want to show off, they tell stories. So it's not about, it's no longer about an event in 1787, but it's a story behind it. So what actually happened? Well, what's generally not known is that at that time she was doing this and it becomes a story, and that's how they show off, and that's where their real creativity comes from.
and I suppose the stories enable us to remember thousands of facts, whereas if they were bullet points, we'd remember, maybe half a dozen. And some cultures, as you say, they have passed down their history orally. Like I know in Hawaii, for example, this is just one example, that they didn't write things down, but they passed like their stories down from generation to generation through. And some of those stories were like 3 days long. It would take you about 3 days to recite the story. And
that's fantastic.
Yeah, and they were
I love that.
memorized.
I love that.
Mm-hmm.
I love the fact that they won't be limited by preconceptions about how long is a story. I mean, it's like how long is a joke? I mean, I'm going to start and I'll finish when I finish. But if you want to hear the story, it's going to take this long. So
that's right. And you see, and also in the West, we have this this linear kind of idea of like, well, a story has to begin with an introduction, it has to end with a conclusion, whereas not every culture has a they don't, stories are not always linear. And sometimes I've heard Native Americans talk, and it was like they go around in circles, and it's like, well, this is the story. It's like, there is no ending.
which infuriates the logical thinkers, because it's illogical. Because it doesn't, it's like, hold on, but it's a fascinating area, and it's one that I love and feel so strongly about. And I think, it was, I mean, as I say, I grew up in Australia. My education was very white. It was very Anglo-Saxon. And so all of the things that are wrong with traditional education, I mean, there's good things about it, but all the things that were wrong were so evident to me until about my second last year of high school. I think it was second last year. And I had an English teacher, Peter Cornish. And at the time, I didn't like him at all. He was difficult. He was demanding, but he would say, I want you to write an essay for Monday, and the topic is umbrellas or clay or a face in a crowd, or nothing. Nothing was the topic one for one essay. And the real clincher was widdershins. He said, I want you to write an essay for Monday, and the topic is widdershins. And of course, everyone said, what's widdershins, sir? And he said, you have dictionaries? And so I had no idea what widdershins was. I looked it up and it was contrary to the direction of the sun. I thought, well, this is not science, it's English. So he doesn't want me to write about the Earth's rotation and whatever else. And he was testing us all the time. Clay, he didn't want to understand, didn't want us to write about the physical properties of clay. He wanted us to use clay as a catalyst for a story. And I wrote to him, I tracked him down, he's mid-80s now, I tracked him down last year, and I wrote to him and said, look, as a 16-year-old, I never really appreciated what you were doing, but I just want to thank you for making me think, making me use my creative brain and making me become a storyteller, which he did. And he never told us why he was doing it. He would just do it. And by doing it, he was forcing us to use a part of our brain and he was using it. We had to use our imaginations. And that's what hadn't really been challenged.
Did he reply to you when you got in touch with him last year? Did he reply to you?
Yes, he did. He did, which was lovely. I mean, he just appreciated, even though it was a long time since I was at school, but he appreciated that I would take the time to write to him and thank him. I thanked him for igniting or reigniting, my love of writing and my interest in creative expression through words.
You see, Greg, that's a wonderful story. And it's another example that confirms the fact that the deepest level of learning, the best kind of teaching, you don't realize it very often until decades later.
Yes.
And the reason I say this is because for many years, my job was to observe others teaching and to grade them. And I would very often say, well, this, like the lesson, like it might, in terms of tangible outcomes, there might not have been any, but I could feel that students, even though tangibly there was no evidence in the short term, I could feel that, long-term impact had been gained.
Yes.
That long-term impact wouldn't be.
Yeah, isn't that interesting? I think back to all of the teachers that I had through high school, more than in primary school. I don't remember the primary school teachers so well. I remember a couple of them, but it's certainly in high school. And even teaching subjects which are rooted in logic, mathematics and sciences, and there were still teachers who were able to bring those subjects to life through stories, through creativity, through, it was an interesting, I started studying architecture and it was only when I was doing architecture that I finally understood the relationship between trigonometry and what's the other, mental block.
Geometry?
No, not geometry. It'll come to me anyway. But I understood the value of trigonometry. I understood its role in the world. It was, and this is the problem, I think. I was sitting through a EduTech conference, a session yesterday, and a school there was a vice principal of a new school in Brisbane, and they developed their not their curriculum so much, but their methodology in partnership with the University of Queensland. And And so what they're doing is they're teaching in a hybrid style. An example, that they would have the kids out in the yard throwing shot puts, but they then take them into the classroom and they talk about mathematics and they talk about gravity, all relating to throwing that lead ball. So obviously the effect of gravity on it, the velocity at which it leaves their hands. And so what this deputy principal was saying is that, we've developed this, we are developing a hybrid style of learning, but our way of evaluating students hasn't caught up with it yet. That we're still evaluating students and scoring students in an insular way, so that we're still, we are marking them in a mathematics exam, and then in a science exam, and then in an English exam, and nobody is, the system hasn't yet worked out a way to say, well, look, all these things work together. So how can we help kids together, holistically?
The thing is, it's about the purpose of education. We have to look at, what is the purpose of education? And if the purpose of education is for students to get jobs in the fields that they would like to, establish their careers in, if that is the purpose of education, then the assessment needs to be tailored to enable them to gain access to those things. You talk about architecture. So for example, when you're studying architecture, there has to be, there's a story about architecture, and then there's the facts about architecture. There are basic facts that you have to learn that are not subject to interpretation, and there's the life of it, the motivations, the aspirations, what the experiences that you can have if you construct particular buildings, but there are also the facts. And so I think there is a tendency for us to assess simply on the factual basis rather than the stories around it, the inanimate aspects.
Yes. Yeah. So what can we do in terms of because I know you've actually got like Q&A sessions for the conference, but also little interview sessions as well. So
this is the interview session.
This is the interview session. Okay, fabulous. Look, I think, my career has been in creativity. As a writer, and then teaching creative thinking to business leaders, because my issue has been for many years that traditional education is teaching people to administer, but not teaching people to lead. And to lead, you need creativity. And as part of that process, storytelling is such an important and often forgotten aspect, because each of us is a story. We have a story to tell, every single one of us. Every organization has a story to tell. Everything that is produced. You're talking about, the knickknacks on the wall behind me. Each of those has a story. And it's those stories that bring them to life. Otherwise, as you said, they are simply
inanimate objects. Yeah.
Inanimate objects. It's a box that's painted, put some glass on it, and that's it. But you go to the villages where some of this stuff is made, and you chat to the families who are making them, and the histories that are behind them. Why that critter? Why this? Why are they doing that? How did this town become a town of? There was one town in Oaxaca, and they were specialists in making wax flowers. Absolutely extraordinarily lifelike wax flowers. So how on earth did you end up specializing in this. Or another village would do, they specialize in paper cutting. So all those all those banners that you see for Mexican fiestas, traditionally they're hand cut. And each of these villages has found this specialty, and it's especially rich around Oaxaca. And it's the story of each of these items that for me is the exciting thing.
And to acquire the skills, like whatever those, like to make those flowers out of wax so that they look almost as though they are real, that requires years and years and years of practice and experimentation.
So that's where the technical stuff, that's where the technical side comes from. That's the practice. But the idea, where did the idea come from? Why that? And then how long do you need to do this? I mean, I love the fact that, Japanese master craftsmen still describe themselves as students at the age of 80 or 90. And they have specialized in basket weaving. And you look at the stuff that they do and you think this is absolutely perfect in its execution. But they can look at it and say, yes, it's not bad. I'm getting there. I'm getting there, which I think is I think humility is a really critical ingredient in creativity and in learning. I think curiosity is critical as well. I think a desire to learn is critical, to explore is critical. And I think that's where I remember going to a school reunion. It's another story. So I remember going to school reunion, 20th anniversary. And I was talking to a mate of mine who became a lawyer, worked in London for most of his life. And this is the first time we'd seen most of our schoolmates in 20 years. And he said, have a look around this room. He said, if you didn't know we're all in the same year at school, you'd guess our ages are between 30 and probably mid-50s. And I said, yeah. I said, the interesting thing is that everyone here who looks like he's in his mid-50s was old at 17 or 18. And the shutter had gone down. So the curiosity had been killed somewhere early on. And the interest wasn't there. And it worries me with younger people. I talk to nieces and nephews and now their kids who are confronted with a fact, a bit of information. They clearly don't know what it is, but they don't ask. They're not curious to actually understand. So what does that mean? What is that? It's like this blankness there. And I think there's no curiosity. There's no curiosity there.
Well, there is that saying that when we stop growing, we start dying.
Yes, yeah, and it's so true, and it's so true. And for me, I often said to people, Peter Cornish aside, I've often said to people, my education started when I left school, because that's where I really started to learn stuff and my curiosity. I used to spend most of my time in school, in high school, drawing cars and houses. And so it's not surprising that I started out doing architecture, because I'd lost interest. I just lost interest in what was being taught to me, because I couldn't see the value in it.
Yeah.
And it wasn't being taught to me in a way that piqued my curiosity. Whereas, when you get older and you get a bit wiser, you think, well, actually, there's a lot of really curious, interesting stuff about physics. But at the time, when I'm 15 years old, I couldn't care less about it. Absolutely couldn't care less, because it was just facts. It was just facts. There was no story being told. And And the great physicists are great storytellers. All the great scientists are great storytellers, and all the great scientists are incredibly creative. So, which comes us back to where we kind of started, that there are scientists who will look at something purely as a functional object, as an assembly of pieces, and can tell you everything about the density of that wood or whatever it happens to be, the toxicity of paint, whatever. But step back a minute. What's the story?
There needs to be both, doesn't there? So
yes.
It's not as though it's only a story, because I suppose that for the Aboriginal Australians, a lot of their beliefs get dismissed because it seemed to be like, well, that's just a story, there's no facts in that, it's just a story, and it can be dismissed so easily until, like, say for example, quantum physics, science can relate to the dream time, once you make that connection with something else, then it becomes more credible. But so there needs to be this connection between what is animate and what is inanimate, what is fact, what is story, and what is real and what is constructed.
And I think, I mean, here in Australia, we're getting better than we were, but for many, many years, we didn't even acknowledge the Aboriginal culture. We didn't acknowledge, the tens of thousands of years of history that had preceded white settlement here. Our history started in 1788, and with a sort of brief nod to Dirk Hartog and a couple of others who kind of visited but left. But that was it. And then now, we had the horrendous bushfires here, summer before last, and a lot of people started saying, you know what, our Aborigines knew how to manage the land, and they were saying, you're doing this wrong. You're doing this wrong. This is going to be catastrophic. And they knew, but because we didn't value their stories, and those stories were passed down. They were passed down from father to son to daughter to mother, your mother to daughter. They were passed down. We didn't acknowledge them because there wasn't a book. There wasn't a book of of Isaac Newton theories. It didn't exist. But they kind of learnt. They learned that their connection with the land was so strong, they could intuit what needed to be done, and they did it, and then they passed down that knowledge to younger members of the family, of the community. So and that's about
which stories do we elevate, which stories do we make popular, and which stories do we dismiss, do we ignore. And these stories, like the Aboriginal stories, they're so powerful that even if they are dismissed, they still continue to survive. They continue to re-emerge when the time and the place is right for them.
Well, isn't it interesting how our brains just subconsciously file bits of information away, and stories would be part of that, so that there are certain stories that we'll tell at parties. There are stories that we tell, complete trivia stories that we might just tell to a stranger as part of a casual conversation. And there are stories that we know have a lot more meaning and a lot more significance. And it's those ones that influence our lives, and we kind of remember. And there are things that I remember so vividly from when I was young, things that I experienced or learnt, and the stories around those, and I can recite those as stories and tell them as stories. Whereas others, I have no idea I've stored that information sometimes, and then it just comes out. Oh yeah, I remember such and such. I think we're talking about about storytelling being a lost art, and it is in a sense. But we haven't actually lost it, I don't think. I think it's been suppressed. It's been suppressed by you know, the expectations of our parents, by the education system, by the pressure, you know, the covert pressure from our friends, peers as we're growing up, and also by a system that values logic over creativity. And you know, as I mentioned, that I'm working with a couple of educators in Malaysia, and they've started a couple of schools there to try to elevate creative thinking in the education system. As you can imagine, in Asia, where there's a deep rooted belief by parents that their kids need to learn mathematics, they need to learn English, because these are the things that are going to help them in business. And what they're trying to do is to communicate that, yes, you need those things and they are useful, but they're more useful in a management role than in a leadership role. Where a leader needs to be creative, a leader needs to have vision, a leader needs to think what if, say what if, to imagine the possible. Whereas, you know, understanding mathematics, speaking good English are useful in a management role, in an administrative role. And I think, what's his name? Jack Ma, you know, having been a teacher, and he's, you know, stepped away from his role in Alibaba. But, you know, I remember he said a few years ago, he said, we're teaching our kids the wrong things. We're teaching them stuff that computers can already do better than us. And that's not going to help them in any way at all. Do we need to go? It's probably about, how much time did we allow?
That's about right now. That's about right, Greg. So, okay, excellent. Well, that's been a wonderful conversation. Hopefully I will speak to you again very soon, Greg.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's been great. All right, take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.